July 1st, 1863. The Confederate Army had invaded the North, and they were planning to march southward toward Washington, D.C. The famous Battle of Gettysburg ensued. Gettysburg was had two critical pieces to it. Number one, it was a direct line from the North Hook downward to Washington, giving the Confederacy a highly strategic advantage in terms of the march toward the capital. But also, Gettysburg had shoe factories, and there was an abundance of shoes, and Robert E. Lee needed to put shoes on the feet of his soldiers. Many of them were running around barefoot. So he decided to attack Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863. And as he was moving westward, the Union troops had created what was like a fish hook to surround the town to protect it and also stop the Confederate advance. In the middle of that fish hook, on the western side, was a farm. It was called McPherson's Farm. And on the edge of the farm was this ridge, and it was probably one of the best pieces of ground for the battle. And both sides realized that this ridge needed to be controlled, because whoever controlled McPherson's Ridge could possibly win this particular battle. So the Union troops had moved into place, the Confederates started to attack, and there was a group of men from Wisconsin. The 2nd Wisconsin Brigade was assigned to hold that ground and to keep it so other reinforcements could come in and they can maintain McPherson's Ridge. What ended up happening on that first day was one of the bloodiest moments of the battle, and when the 2nd Wisconsin went into battle that morning, they had 302 men. By the end of the day, they had suffered 233 casualties. Only 69 walked off the field that day. Over 77% of them were either killed in action, wounded in action, prisoners of war, or missing in action. One of the highest percentages of loss for one day during the course of the war. They were dubbed the Iron Brigade, and rightfully so. Those men had nerves of steel. And they stood and were courageous, and they held the ground and made a strategic move, thus enabling reinforcements to come in and the battle to ensue and become a victory for the Union. What gives people that kind of courage? How do we muster the strength to be able to stand under fire like that? Because when you think about it, we're in the middle of a battle ourselves. We're in a cultural war right now as Christians. We're also in a battle internally as we struggle and wrestle with sin. And the question is, how do we develop the courage to stand under fire today? And we find here in Corinthians, 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul giving some illustrations and then finally some very brief exhortations in this concluding piece of his letter. He writes this: "But I will come to you after I go through Macedonia, for I'm going through Macedonia, and perhaps I will stay with you or even spend the winter, so that you may send me on my way wherever I may go. For I do not wish to see you now just in passing, for I hope to remain with you for some time if the Lord permits. But I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost, for a wide door of effective service is open to me, and there are many adversaries. Now if Timothy comes, see that he is with you without cause to be afraid, for he is doing the Lord's work, as I also am. So let no one despise him, but send him on his way in peace, so that he may come to me, for I expect him with the brethren. But concerning Apollos, our brother, I encouraged him greatly to come to you with the brethren, and it was not at all his desire to come now, but he will come when he has opportunity. Be on alert, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. Let all you do be done in love." And we'll stop right there. We open here with these three conflicts as Paul brings the letter to a conclusion. Jesus made it very clear. In this world, you're going to have trouble. And Paul spells that out right here as he's concluding Corinthians. The first conflict was his own. It tells us here he faced adversary, opposition. Paul was constantly in battle. If you look at his writings, you find that he has been beaten, he has been stoned, he has been chased, he has been taunted like a criminal, he has spent nights on the sea, he's gone hungry and naked, he is contending with all sorts of stress, and he faces significant opposition. If you look at the next character in line here, you have Timothy. Timothy battles fear. In fact, this is going to be an ongoing struggle for Timothy. When we see 2 Timothy written by Paul to Timothy, he's ready to quit the ministry. He's wrestling with anxiety. He's ready to throw in the towel. He has had it. He's a young man. The pressure is on. And Paul says to him, God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but one of love and of power and of self-discipline. So we see here the second battle that is recorded in Corinthians is one of fear and anxiety, which is something many people are struggling with today. We have opposition, we have anxiety, and then finally we have Apollos here. Apollos didn't even want to go. I mean, Apollos had this mission, this task, this deed in front of him, this objective that he needed to accomplish, and we find that Apollos was wrestling what? The battle was with his own will. And many of us go through that as well. How often do we think to ourselves, well, I want to get up on Sunday morning and go to the lake, or have a nice relaxing breakfast, or, the thought of just not being involved, not stepping up, is a temptation we face all the time. The battle of the will, what I do and I don't want to do, this wrestling match that we grapple with on a regular basis, is something we're all very familiar with. When we talk about conflict, we see it here in the scripture. But we also find that there was tremendous conflict in the 1860s. The question is raised, of course, why did they fight? And we find that there was a lot of differences back during the 1850s, 1860s. It really started perhaps at the beginning of the Revolutionary War era. Dr. James McPherson, a Princetonian and a professor down in New Jersey, was considered one of the premier historians when it came to the Civil War. And he wrote a book. It was called For Cause and Comrades. And McPherson explores, why did people fight? And, initially the Civil War was fought for honor. It was fought out of a sense of duty. There was economic disparities. There was tremendous political turmoil. The election of 1860 was an absolute disaster when it comes to dividing the country. It didn't unite the country. It split a deeper wedge within the country, so we had political issues. The matter of slavery was always on the forefront in terms of the abolition of slavery versus keeping slaves. But at the end of the day, when you really think about it, why do people fight? And James gives us the answer to that. We fight and quarrel amongst ourselves because of the desires that battle within. Really, when you get down to it, the Civil War, like the cultural war that we're facing today, like the war that we have within our own hearts and minds, revolves around the will. What do we want? Who is in charge? Who controls? Many of the southern states saw the aggression of Abraham Lincoln in mustering up an army as an assault against their homeland and against their freedom. And they were fighting to preserve their rights. They wanted to maintain sovereignty. Others wanted to enable the slaves to have rights because they didn't have any. They were considered a piece of property back in that time. It was a battle over the will. And the cost was tremendous. When we talk about casualties and the price that was paid, during the Civil War, killed in action over 204,000 Union troops, died from disease, 388,000. Historians have attempted to put together some sort of a number because there was many who were missing, there was accidents, people who died in prison. They've estimated that the number of casualties during the Civil War was probably upward about 850, maybe even more, 850,000. When we talk about casualties, we also see the wounded, over 500,000 combined, north and south. We have a picture here of the beginning of the Red Cross. Clara Barton had started a corps of women to minister to the needs of those who had been seriously wounded, and the need was just tremendous. Prisoners of war during the Civil War. We have, got to go back. Can we go back? How do we go back? I can't. Can you go back? Over, here we go. We'll get to them. Here we go. Whoops. We'll get it. 600,000+ were captured and spent time in prison camps. These casualties, this price, this cost, there we go. There's a sample, with 10% dying in prison. It was just tremendous. And to think that these folk spent 4 long, arduous years battling it out. And it wasn't just on the battlefield itself. It was on the home front. You had wives and children, families supporting. It was a tremendous effort that was poured into this conflict. And when we think about the conflict that we face here in the culture wars, there's a wonderful question that we need to ask as well. Why do people leave? We're in the middle of a battle right now, and it's over the heart and souls of this country. When you think about the numbers of people who used to attend church versus those who are attending church, it's quite dramatic. The number of casualties in the culture war just last year alone, 4,000 churches closed in 2023. We have missing in action. 1992, 90% of the populace in the United States identified as Christian. Last year, that number dropped to 63%. And the question, of course, is why? Why is this happening? Why are we in the midst of this war, and it seems as if Christianity is falling further and further behind? We're fighting over marriage, identity, what it means to be saved. I mean, we have folk out there thinking, so long as I'm a good person, as long as I go to church, as long as I maintain morality, as long as I don't go out there and kill anybody or rob anything, I'm okay. And that's a falsehood. We're in the midst of a culture war. We're in the midst of a war over the soul. But when you get down to it, as in the words of John MacArthur, it's a war over truth and lies, fidelity or lack thereof. The scriptures explain to us quite plainly that Jesus came to die and rise again to give us a free gift that is not merited, that is not earned. It is not something that we acquire by virtue of sacrament or ritual or attendance, but that is freely given to us because of the mercy and the grace of a holy God, so that we can be forgiven and free. You want to talk about casualties and sacrifice? His was the ultimate. The Son of God comes to earth, walks among us, and pays the price on your behalf and mine so that we can enjoy freedom and have a relationship with a holy God. And that's in dispute. In fact, there are many people who claim to be Christians who will say, well, that's nice, but if you're a good person, you're still going to get in. That's the conflict. It's a matter of truth. It's a matter of also the will. And the battle that is being waged right now is not about marriage and identity. It's about control. It's no different than what we see in the Civil War, except it's being played out on the cultural field, not necessarily the battlefield. So what we find here, point number one, is really quite simple. Believers live in a world of conflict. We always have and we always will. And it is just a reality of how life is going to be. Jesus made it clear, and it has been playing out for the last 2,000 years. Which really brings us to Paul's exhortation and the heart and soul of this entire message, and that is in the final verse here, in verse 13, it says, "Be on your guard, stand firm in the faith, be men of courage, be strong, and do everything in love." There's a 5-part exhortation here in light of this conflict that we are going through. Number one, we are called to stand and to guard. Be on guard. Be on alert. You do not know when the time will come. Those are Union pickets, by the way. During the Civil War, you had picket duty. And a picket was basically somebody who had to go out there and watch for the enemy. You had to stand in the woods, you had to stand in the field, you had to stand on the ridge, you had to be looking around. And a picket was very critical. Because if you didn't have pickets, if you didn't have people watching the battlefield and watching the camp and watching the troops and watching the supply lines, you were vulnerable to attack. What does Paul say to us here? He says, be on your guard. That's literally a military term in Greek. It means to watch, to be aware, to be looking, to not go through life with your eyes blind and your ears shut to what's happening around you. Because we are filled in a world with false teaching and false teachers and lies. And we have to be wary and questioning and watching how much of the entire New Testament, when you look at the writings of the apostles and you break it down, a huge percentage of the entire New Testament is geared and aimed at correcting false teaching. There's all sorts of things that were propagated and infiltrating the church, and they had to put a stop to it so that people would not be led astray, because what you believe impacts how you behave. And if your belief system is off, your behavior is going to be off, and you're going to continue to drift and not only be a poor witness for Christ, but could end up in a whole boatload of sinful trouble. And what we find in the scriptures that there's over and over and over again, there's these exhortations to watch, be on your guard, be wary, be waiting, be looking out because of this very issue. Point number 1, stand guard. Number 2, stand firm. Isaiah says this, if you do not stand by faith, you will not stand at all. One of the major problems that they had during the Civil War was deserting. And I'm not talking about deserts like, cookies. I'm talking about desert like as in running away. Over 200,000 Union troops deserted. Over 100,000 troops on the Confederacy took off. And they asked them, why do they have all these deserters? And at the end of the day, fear was a major factor. I mean, the description of the life of a soldier was once penned like this. It's 98% sheer boredom and 2% sheer hell. And when some of these troops who had marched out into battle saw the horror of what was happening, they were scared and they didn't want to return. The bulk of the people who deserted actually were not afraid, but had a conflict of interest. Because they were coming off of the farms and out of the fields, and because there was no Social Security or any sort of a provision made for the families back home, what ended up happening very often is that a soldier would be sitting in camp, they'd get a letter from home, it'd be a wife or a mom or a loved one saying, you need to come back, we can't eat, we need to have wood chopped. We need to have, the fireplace, is getting cold. We have to get our crops in the ground. We've got to get the apples picked. We've got to get the hogs in. They needed help. They were struggling economically. And more often than not, a lot of the troops would have to beat feet home and take off because they had so many problems on the home front that they needed to tend to things for their families. They had conflicting interest. Paul speaks about this in 2 Timothy. He says, be a good soldier and keep to the mission, not be wavering back and forth. And one of the things that we find in the church today, part of the battle where we're falling, is that we're double-minded. We want convenient Christianity. We want to show up when it works for my schedule. We want to be involved when I don't have anything else going on. And we like to have one foot with the world and one foot with the Lord. And that's how we end up serving very often. And that's what Jesus calls being lukewarm. And that is a true travesty that has been occurring since the beginning of the church. It's a lack of commitment. We're dual commitment. We're running in one direction for a little while and then vacillating over to another direction afterwards. And how can anybody function that way? You think about it for a moment. How can any organization, think of a sports team, think of a concert, a play, a business, a school. How can they function if you only have 50% of the people showing up? It doesn't work. You need everyone participating and involved. And this was one of the problems that they had in the Civil War, and it's a problem we have today. So we need to stand firm. We need to stand firm in the faith and be committed. It goes on to tell us this, number 3, that we need to stand courageously. Be strong and courageous, it tells us here in Deuteronomy. This next exhortation, we have to be on guard, to stand firm. It says, be men of courage. This is a very unusual term. In fact, it's not found anywhere else in the New Testament or the Old Testament, this idea of courage in the Greek language here. The word courage appears throughout the Bible. This isn't the only place. But when you hear the word courage being mentioned in the Old Testament, New Testament, very often it's to have confidence in God and to be strong in God and to stand firm in His Word and to be able to move forth in such a way. This particular word, only used once, it's androzomai. I'm not going to quiz you on that. But it carries with it the idea of being responsible. If you were to translate this literally, man up. Get off your duff. Get off the couch. Recognize that you have a responsibility to play. Realize that you have a role in this world. Don't be a wuss. And do something. Don't let fear hold you back, but man up. That's literally what's being conveyed here in the language. When you think about the number of people who were mobilized for the Civil War, there's 2.2 million Union troops, almost 1 million Confederates, which is an enormous number during that day and age. But think about the number of people who were there to support them. It was an entire national effort. Everybody had to get involved. I mean, you had factories that needed to be run. You had crops that needed to be planted. You had, manufacturing, guns needed to be made, cannons needed to be forged. I mean, the effort was just tremendous. For every one person that was out there on the battlefield, there needed to be like 10 back home carrying the load, pulling the weight, doing the work. The uniform I have over here, just as a great example, that's a musician's coat. And one of the reasons why we know it's an authentic piece, an artifact, is by the stitching. And you're talking, a couple million outfits had to be put together for these soldiers to get out there in the field. And they were not just made in some factory somewhere. In fact, what makes this a unique piece is that prior to the Civil War, all uniforms were manufactured by hand, and they were stitched by hand. After the Civil War, they were all made using sewing machines. During the Civil War, it was a combination of hand-stitched and also being run by a machine. And that particular coat, and this is why we know it's the real deal, is it has the two types of stitching. That's what would authenticate a piece of clothing. Think about it. You've got a couple million people running around. They need hats, they need coats, they need blankets, they need trousers, they need all sorts of things. Who's making it? This is a massive effort. There was like thousands upon thousands of people, not just in the factories, but hand stitching these things and putting them together so the troops had what they needed. It was a huge effort. People stood up, recognized they had a responsibility, recognized they had a role to play, and they got involved, and we need to do the same. It's a beautiful example of how we have to live our lives as believers, getting up, getting out of the pew, and getting involved. There was some recent studies done about post-COVID in the church, and how many churches recovered, and how many churches are still limping along, and some of the problems that it's had ever since we had the epidemic. And one of the things that they found very unique and interesting in terms of some of the stats in church life is that the bigger the church, the greater the hit they took percentage-wise in terms of people not coming back after COVID. The loss was greater in the mega churches versus the little churches. And they were asking the question, well, why is that? And it came down to involvement. Historically, since stats have been run on church life, the smaller churches historically have a higher percentage of people who are involved. And because of that involvement, they have been more resilient to the culture wars and all the pressure that is coming upon them. That is why more of the smaller churches have maintained their attendance and have maintained their health versus some of the larger ones, because of the fact that there has been less involvement. And this is exactly what we see here during the war effort and what we are being exhorted to do as well, to be responsible, get involved. You're going to grow. You're going to encourage. You're going to support. You're going to be appreciated. We need folk in the nursery. We need people to help serve food. We need musicians. We need people to just, be willing to roll up their sleeves and be involved. And this is what Paul is saying. Stand guard. Stand in the faith. Stand courageous. He says, stand strong. The next one. Listen to what we find here in Philippians. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. How do you become strong? You got to work out. People just don't come into the world and are muscular and capable of doing things. You have to grow. You have to exercise. You need resistance. And through that drilling, that's how we become strong. When Paul writes this here, I can do all things through him who gives me strength, he has learned by virtue of a process. During the war, troops had to train. They didn't train very long. 6 weeks was considered a long boot camp back in the 1860s. But they drilled constantly. The average Civil War soldier only fought once a month, 1 day a month. When you look at all the numbers, they normally were in camp 30 out of 30 days a month, and 1 day they went out and faced battle. During those other 30 days, they marched, they drilled, they practiced. Why? So they could become more proficient. That's how we get better at things. Talk to anybody who's in sports, talk to anybody who's in music, talk to anybody who does anything of any proficiency. What enables you to become better at it? Practice. How do we become stronger? We practice. We get involved, we walk by faith, not just when it's convenient, not just when we're in a crisis, but on a regular basis. And that's how we grow. Number 5, stand in love. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then this one conveys volumes. Love covers over, it says, a multitude of sins. And what you're looking at is a picture that was taken 50 years after the Battle of Gettysburg. At the anniversary in 1913, Confederate and Union troops came together for a few days to reconcile, to reconnect. And what we have is a man from the South and the man from the North shaking hands in fellowship. The Civil War is filled with horrible stories of brutality and suffering and loss. However, it's also filled with tremendous testimony of compassion, love, and concern. There was a chaplain from Vermont by the name of Gordon Winslow. He served with the regiment New York. And Winslow not only was involved in the spiritual affairs of tending to people and helping folk out to discover Christ and to find encouragement through his word, but he also was involved with medical triage and had been working with wounded troops. And he lost his life in a sad accident as they were ferrying troops who were wounded across the Potomac. He fell out of a boat and drowned in the river. He made the ultimate sacrifice as he was displaying mercy, as he was displaying grace, and as he was displaying compassion. Love drives the train. If we're going to stand firm, if we're going to stand guard, if we're going to stand together, if we're going to be courageous, if we're going to get up and be involved, we need to be fueled ultimately by a love for God and a love for one another. At the bottom line, during this conflict that we will face every day, we need to display courage. Courage to walk by faith. Courage to be on the watch. Courage to be involved in the lives of other people. And a picture of courage was found in the Battle of Chickamauga, 1860. It was the fall. Between September 18th and the 20th, the second worst battle of the Civil War was fought in Tennessee. Gettysburg had over 50,000 casualties. The Battle of Chickamauga was probably around 34,000 casualties. The Union had been advancing down through Tennessee, and they were looking to cut the Confederacy in half. And as they were marching through, they came to where we would call the border of Georgia and Tennessee. There was this creek or river. It's called the Chickamauga Creek. That's a Cherokee term. It literally means the river of death, and that was what it was. And as the Union troops were moving down, as they were advancing in their invasion, they decided to try to flank the Confederates, and they left a gap in their line. The Confederates realized that there was a hole in the line. They punched right through and were able to split the army and drive the Union troops back. During that retreat, which was an absolute disaster for the Union Army, many soldiers were being captured. There was a high number of prisoners of war during the Battle of Chickamauga. There was this one particular colonel who was mounted on horseback. He was a Confederate. He was leading his troops through this hole up there, trying to capture as many of the retreating troops. And he came upon a group from Michigan, and he commanded and demanded that they would surrender. There was this one guy in this group. His name was Johnny Clem. Johnny saw this Confederate commander running up and down the line on his horse, pistol in hand, and Johnny Clem turned around, took his rifle, took aim, and shot the guy right off his horse. And the rest of the guys from Michigan were able to escape. And what makes this unique, the story about Johnny Clem is this. Johnny was 12 years old. A 12-year-old boy with a musket that had been cut down so he could carry it was a hero on the battlefield. Johnny Clem was the youngest non-commissioned officer to be elevated to the rank of sergeant. He continued to fight throughout the war. He was wounded twice, captured once as a prisoner of war for just a few weeks. When they found his hat, he was upset because the Confederates took his hat from him. He had 3 bullet holes in his hat. This little guy was crazy courageous. I've got another picture of him here. That's not the musket he used, by the way. It's way too big. But here you have a 12-year-old who was able to put down his cell phone and get away from his video games for a little while and displayed tremendous courage under fire. Now, friends, if a 12-year-old can step onto the battlefield and display that type of valor under fire, then the God of the universe, who gives us his strength and gives us his power and gives us his spirit, will give us the courage to stand in the culture wars that we are facing today, that we may be able to speak the truth in love and not back down as well. Which leads us to the final point, which is really this: be courageous. We need to be a courageous church. Not an abrasive church, but a courageous church. A church that's willing to look at someone and love them enough to speak the truth to them. The truth of Jesus Christ, the truth of his word, the truth of his love, the truth of his holiness, the truth of his righteousness. This is what we're called to be and do, to be salt and light in a world that needs truth. Because Jesus said it plainly, if we know the truth, we will find freedom. Let's pray.